Peter's asked me to scare the hell out of you first. I'm not sure that I want to do all that much scaring, but I want to show some data. So up here is a slide that sort of reminds us why we're probably all here. We're concerned about climate change and the carbon problem. Here is the sort of historical CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. This is the more famous Keeling curve that shows you the seasonal variation. This is, I guess, the Al Gore famous slide now. Should be the Al Gore curve. So this really shows how we're ratcheting up carbon in the atmosphere year over year. So that ultimately leads to climate change. So this is from the Stern report. This is real measured temperature data for every large red dot you see on the map of the globe there. That's 1 degree Celsius temperature change per decade for the last 25 years. You average all of that, and that's why we have this globally increasing average temperature. So that is the end outcome. So the real question, so I'm not a climate scientist. I'm really I'm an engineer, and I'm very solutions oriented. And so when confronted with this climate problem, I really wanted to get to the nut of it. What temperature do we actually want? And in some respects, this climate change problem is an aesthetic choice for humanity. How bad do we want it to be, or how good do we want it to be? And so you'd like to have a way of figuring out how to answer that question. Once you've figured out what temperature you want, you can figure out what CO2 concentration you need to aim at. And that gives you a framework that you can then work backwards. Okay, we want to hit a target of 450 or 400 or 350. What do I need to do in order to get there? So this is actually a recent paper in Nature. This is a different way to look at the carbon problem. Because CO2 takes a long time to fall back out of the atmosphere and sequester, a realistic way to look at the carbon problem is we have a certain amount to burn before you have to stop cold turkey to hit a specific target. And this is thinking that started with Kumi and Krauss about 20 years ago and is becoming a new way to talk about carbon. So basically, from yellow to red on this slide is the probability of staying below 2 degrees of warming. 2 degrees of warming is something that people choose to as sort of the most that we probably are prepared to tolerate. And on the bottom axis there, you see a number of bars. And so these represent how many gigatons of carbon we can burn before we hit the probability of, a certain probability of going over 2 degrees. What this really tells you is we have a set number, a few 100 billion tons of carbon that we can burn before we have to stop cold turkey, and you can work backwards from this to figure out what you have to do. The reason that it's nice to have this particular framework is if you look at the carbon problem this way, you can take a piece of legislation like the upcoming energy bill, and you can say, you can map how much carbon that energy bill commits us to and say, and then map it back into this, and you can see that, for example, if you summed all of the world's government's commitments to carbon reduction, that we hit about 600 ppm. So you can actually use this sort of logical analysis to say, no, try again, that's not good enough, that doesn't get us to where we actually want to go, because it is about hitting the goal that you want to hit. Grossly, what we need to do is balance the carbon cycle. Right now, we put about 8 billion tons of carbon into the year. We've got to reduce that to maybe 1 or 2. Even that isn't a perfect situation because that will increase the ocean acidity, which has effects on fisheries. All right, so this is how the world currently produces its energy. We use about 18 terawatts of primary energy. The majority comes from natural gas, coal, and oil. As you can see, nuclear is a fairly big contributor, as is hydro, and then the renewables, as we know them, are fairly small. Plants are quite large. That's data that's off the books because that's mostly biomass burnt in developing countries or used for agriculture. This is how we use those 18 terawatts of power in agriculture, in electricity generation, manufacturing, etc. All right. So 18 terawatts is what we need. Where on earth can you get that from? Well, we can get it from nuclear power, or we can get it from these renewable sources. So if you only can remember one slide, this is sort of the overview of where all your energy can possibly come from. Unfortunately, for tidal power, there's only about 3.5 terawatts of total tidal energy potential. So that's not going to be enough to solve the problem completely, but it may contribute in some places. Wave power, similarly. If you collected all the energy of every wave hitting every coastline on the planet, you only get about 3.5 terawatts, or about 1/5 of humanity's power supply. So now we can look rationally at wave power and say, yes, it's a contributor for some communities, it's not the solution. The really big solutions here are things like solar. So there's more than 80,000 terawatts of solar energy that hits the surface of the Earth. The good news is that's a huge number compared to what we need. Similarly, there's about 4,000 terawatts of wind power at all altitudes. That's actually why I started a high-altitude wind power company, to go after that. And wind power at low or high altitudes is something that we have to do at a great rate. Hydroelectric power, once you get all the raindrops to fall onto a continent, you only get about 20 terawatts potential. By the time it makes it to rivers, about 7. So we have to be realistic about hydroelectric. Geothermal, there's about 32 terawatts heat flux in total. So yes, it's a big part of the solution. It's not the ultimate solution. All right, so once you sort of arm yourself with the options, you then can say something like this. Current demand, 16 terawatts, and we're only going to be able to do about 2 or 3 terawatts of that with fossil fuels. Existing non-carbon fuels are about 1.5 terawatts, so you can do something like 16 minus those two numbers. We need to do about 11.5 terawatts of new clean energy, and you need to do it sort of by mid-century. Okay, so what does that look like? Imagine you're technology agnostic and you say, we're just going to take those 11.5 terawatts roughly from the things that we know that work today. So 3 terawatts of nuclear, 2 terawatts of geothermal, 2 terawatts of wind, 2 of solar thermal, 2 of photovoltaics, and just for fun, 0.5 terawatt of biofuels. What does it look like to build that in the next 25 years? In order to do that, you have to deploy at about this rate. You'd need to be installing 100 square meters of high efficiency, sort of 15% efficiency solar cells every second for the next 25 years. So every 4 seconds, you have to cover somewhere in the world this room with solar cells. That gives you 2 terawatts of photovoltaic. Solar thermal, you'll have to build 50 square meters of mirrors every second for the next 25 years. In terms of wind, you need to build 12 3-megawatt wind turbines every hour, or 1 3-megawatt wind turbine every 5 minutes for the next 25 years. That's a machine the size of the building that we're in today. For nuclear, it means you need to be building 1 3-gigawatt, that's a full-scale nuclear power facility, one of those every week somewhere in the world for the next 25 years. In terms of geothermal, that's 300 megawatt geothermal power stations every day for the next 25 years. And that geothermal power station is a building roughly the size of this with lots of fancy stainless steel and equipment and a couple of mile-deep holes underneath. Okay, so you've got to build them and drill them pretty quick. In terms of biofuels, 0.5 terawatt of biofuels would mean you're taking a magic biofuel that doesn't even exist today, like a genetically engineered algae, and you're filling an Olympic swimming pool with that every second for the next 25 years. All right, so now you're depressed and you understand the scale of the problem. Is it even possible? I'm going to tell you in, looks like I have 1 minute, that it is. So Americans consume 110 billion soft drink and beer cans every year. If you cut those cans in half or otherwise unrolled all of that aluminum, polished it and made it into solar thermal mirrors, that would be 200 gigawatts installed capacity per year. So, you know, a new business model for Coca-Cola is start just selling the sugar again and actually, you know, become a solar thermal company. Nokia makes about 9 to 12 cell phones per second. I'm not sure how many Apple do, but if you took Nokia, Intel, Apple, AMD, roughly had all of their industrial facility focused on photovoltaics, that's the sort of scale we need to do 2 terawatts. GM used to make 1 car every 2 minutes. GM and Ford together, that's the sort of capacity you need to be making 1 wind turbine every 5 minutes. So this is the good news. So it might sound astoundingly difficult to do an 11.5 terawatts of new power generation in the next 25 years. But if we actually look historically, global power consumption went from 5 terawatts to 15 terawatts in the last 40 years. So there is precedent for doing 10 terawatts of new generating capacity in a pretty short period of time. We just have to do it fundamentally different this time around.